A simple day, a strange proposal. I can't say that that day was exceptional, but as often happens, such days always end with the most unexpected events. At that moment, when I opened my mailbox and a letter appeared on my computer screen, I didn't yet know that it would completely change my life. Saturdays are usually spent in a relaxed atmosphere for me. I always preferred to do something simple, like walk in the park, read books, or work on projects that are always put off until later. I decided that today was a day for a short break, but at some point I decided to do something that I had been putting off for a long time: work on my antique chairs, which I had wanted to restore for so long. After reading a couple of articles on how to do it, I finally gathered all the necessary materials and set myself up for a few hours alone. On my desk lay an old chair that I bought a couple of years ago at a flea market. It was from the era when things were made to last. I always thought that antique furniture had a special atmosphere, so this chair immediately attracted me. Its carving was incredibly detailed, and the wood was already over 100 years old. It is not surprising that the chair had been repaired and restored several times throughout its life. My task was to make it functional again, and at the same time return it to its original beauty. I decided to start by cleaning the surface of the wood, and then opening the old layers of varnish. My hands were splashed with dust and resin, and my head was spinning at that moment about how to do all this correctly. I was an amateur, not a professional. So all this work was not easy for me, but I enjoyed the process, despite my doubts. Just when I was about to pause my work and go get another can of paint, a signal sounded on my phone. A new notification. It was an email from a company I had recently contacted about a vacancy. I didn't remember exactly what it was about because I had put it on my for later list. All I knew was that I had applied and was ready to try my hand at a new field, working with data scientists and research technicians. The email was standard: "Hello, we are happy to inform you that your resume has been accepted and we would like to invite you to join our team." I was a little confused because I didn't expect such a quick response. Was it my skills, however superficial, that caught their attention? Or was it just an automated email? I opened the file attached to the email. Continued from the chapter. When I opened the file, there were several lines describing the job itself. Everything was presented quite clearly and concisely, with responsibilities and requirements. But one line immediately caught my attention: total contract duration, 20,000 hours. I froze. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood something. I read the sentence again and still couldn't figure out what exactly they meant. What was this weird number? At that point, I was sure it was a mistake. Who would sign a contract for 20,000 hours? That's almost 2.5 years of work, and that's without any days off or rest breaks. I thought maybe it was just an autofill template. But since I wasn't paying close attention at the time, I decided not to read too much into the details and just double-check later. I scrolled down the document and noticed that the rest of the contract terms looked pretty standard: part-time, remote work options, even flexibility. Nothing that would immediately cause dissatisfaction. At the very end, there was an offer to sign the contract and send it back. I decided not to waste any more time thinking about it. Could I be sure that this was just a mistake? Or maybe this was some kind of test task? I didn't know. In any case, I couldn't pass up the chance to try something new. Deciding that the mistake could be corrected later, I signed the document and sent it back. When I sent the letter, I felt a little uneasy, but also light, as if I had just made a decision that could change my life. Not even 5 minutes had passed before I received a response from the HR manager with gratitude and instructions on how to proceed. "Congratulations, we are glad to see you on our team. Your manager will contact you shortly." With these words, I closed the laptop and went back to working on the chair. I decided not to think about it until Monday, and for now just take a break from my thoughts. However, I didn't know that the next day would begin with a series of unexpected events. I felt a little sick from the fact that I had essentially just signed a long-term commitment, but now I would have to work with professionals in this field. I felt like I was in the wrong place. I felt like a newbie in this situation. However, despite my uncertainty, I decided not to show my confusion. I silently watched what was happening, listened to the instructions and tried to understand what was expected of me. The problem was that I had absolutely no idea how to perform some of these tasks. But something about this meeting made me wary. During the discussion, it became clear to me that my manager was extremely knowledgeable about data analysis, and he seemed oblivious to my lack of confidence. He continued to give instructions, emphasizing the importance of every detail. We discussed a few general areas of work, such as collecting data and preparing reports for future research. It all sounded like something from another universe. After this meeting, I was given my first task. I opened the file with detailed instructions that they sent me and began to read. An incredible amount of work. The instructions were detailed and clear, but here was the catch: I had to analyze data that clearly could not be processed in a day or a week. This was a huge amount of information, including thousands of tables and graphs. This would require months of work, if not years. I felt anxiety growing inside me. I did not want to be the person who accidentally signed a contract for 20,000 hours and now was trying to somehow get out of the situation. I kept wondering, what if this isn't a mistake? What if this contract isn't just a formality? I spent the entire evening figuring out how to work with this information and realized that I had many new skills to learn. I decided to be prepared for the tough days ahead. The next day, I started doing my first tasks. They were challenging, but not impossible. I felt pretty confident that I could handle something simple like preparing reports, but when it came to complex analytical tasks, I realized that I wasn't ready for this kind of work. At that point, I hadn't yet realized that this work would keep me busy for many years. Progress and first doubts. The days went by and I continued to do my tasks. Each time I sent a report to my manager, I hoped that he wouldn't notice my small mistakes or shortcomings. But his demands seemed to be getting stricter and I felt that I couldn't make mistakes. One day, a week into my job, I received an email with new assignments and realized that I had to complete them by the end of the month. This was an incredible amount of effort. I knew I had to act fast or I wouldn't be able to complete the work on time. Then I asked myself, how much time would I spend on these assignments in the future? How far was I willing to go? There was no turning back now. I had signed the contract and it was a reality. However, the question of what this decision was and why I had signed it continued to haunt me. When you sign a contract for 20,000 hours of work, you hope that it's just an abstract number that has no real meaning. But the more time I spent completing tasks, the more it became clear that this number was there for a reason. 20,000 hours is almost 2.5 years of full-time work. And while I thought it would start out small, the reality was very different. I couldn't believe how quickly I was absorbed by this project, and how quickly I became a part of something much bigger than I expected. As I said, I initially thought this job would be easy. But I soon realized that it was actually much more time-consuming and demanding than I could have imagined. Each day brought new tasks that became more and more difficult. All my expectations began to crumble. At the end of the first week, I noticed that I could no longer divide my time between the project and my other responsibilities. The old furniture that I had wanted to restore so much was now standing in the corner, covered in dust. I couldn't afford to take a break, even for a few hours. I had to work around the clock, and I began to understand that this wasn't just an internship or a temporary project, it had become something much more serious. Every day began in the morning, when I turned on the computer and opened work files. I had gotten used to the fact that I couldn't afford to rest for a long time. After a working day, which often lasted until late in the evening, I was tired, but each time I completed tasks, I felt the responsibility growing. And although my body and mind did not have time to recover, I continued to work anyway. A few more weeks passed. I began to clearly realize that this was not just a job, it had become a part of my life. I could no longer return to my previous rhythm, where I was free from the constant work routine. My life was now completely absorbed by this project, and I felt how all my old hobbies, old habits were disappearing. My friends who used to come to my meetings and parties now came less and less. I couldn't invite them to my place because every time I tried to take a break, I was met with a huge pile of unfinished business. I once thought that if someone had told me that I would work so much, I would definitely not have believed it. But now, sitting in front of the screen and absorbing information, I realized that my life had acquired a completely new shade. I was no longer a free person, but a part of a huge corporation that needed to complete tasks. Returning to the old life. I tried to find time to restore old habits. Walks in the park, reading books, all this was part of my life before I signed that strange contract. I tried to take a couple of days off to at least take a little break from work. But as soon as I turned off the computer, anxiety immediately seized me. I could not just sit idle, knowing that new tasks would be piled up again that needed to be completed. And each day these tasks became more and more difficult. This went on for several weeks. I began to wonder more and more about what would happen if I couldn't handle this project. If I couldn't keep up with the tasks, I would start to disappoint the people who were counting on me. And what if this wasn't a mistake, but a real job that would take up my entire life? However, one evening, when I was particularly tired, I received another email from my manager. It said that I was now supposed to move to a new level of work. The tasks were becoming more specialized, requiring more in-depth knowledge and skills. I was surprised to see that I would have to work not only with analytical data, but also with conducting real-time research. This was something I had never dealt with before. My worries intensified. I again felt that I needed to do something radical to return to my old life. But I couldn't just give up. I knew that if this wasn't a mistake, then I might have to spend my whole life working on this project. New revelations. One day, after a few months, I noticed that the team I was working with started sharing strange data and projects with us that seemed unrelated to what I had done before. I started receiving invitations to meetings where they were discussing completely different projects, strange ideas, and research that seemed extremely abstract. I began to feel that I was not just in a work process, but in something bigger, which went far beyond the usual office routine. One of these meetings caught my attention. The meeting was dedicated to a secret project related to new technologies. They were discussing methods that could change the future of the entire industry, and I realized that if all this was true, then the project I was involved in could be much more important than I thought. However, despite all these interesting offers and opportunities, I still had doubts. What if all this is just another trap? What if I became part of something I couldn't escape, and that this contract wasn't just a job, but something much more dangerous and unpredictable? Every day, spending long hours analyzing data and researching, I was getting deeper and deeper into a world that was becoming less and less understandable to me. What would happen next? What if I couldn't get out of this labyrinth? By that time, more than a year had passed since I signed that contract. Almost 4,000 hours out of 20,000 were behind me. I kept detailed records, I don't know why, maybe to keep from going crazy. I knew that if I just worked day after day, without counting the time, I would wake up one day and find that there was nothing left of my life. That I had not just signed a contract, but rented myself out. And then one morning I woke up not from the alarm clock, as usual, but from silence. It was unusual. The mail was silent. No notifications. No reports, no new tasks. I thought, system failure? I checked the internet, everything worked. The computer was fine. Silence in Slack. Even my manager, usually online at 7 in the morning, did not show up. For the first time in all this time, I went for a walk without headphones, without a schedule, just went out. It was spring. Warm wind, the smell of soil. I looked at people hurrying about their business and suddenly realized, I have no idea what I've been doing for the past months. Tons of data. Graphs. Files. But for what purpose? What was the purpose of this project? What was I really doing? I started asking myself questions that I had previously dodged. Why had I never seen a single end result? Why were all my reports going nowhere, and I wasn't getting any feedback other than the automatic phrases accepted? Thank you. Keep up the good work? I returned home, sat down at the computer and decided, that's it. I'm figuring this out. I opened all the old emails and started chronologically. At first glance, everything seemed standard. But as soon as I dug deeper, something strange began to happen. The emails weren't coming from one address, but from dozens. Different domains, even different languages. Some were from France, some from Korea, some from a domain that didn't even exist on the internet. I moved on. I tried to contact other team members, those I had seen on Zoom calls. No one answered. Their profiles were dead. Some had been deleted. One, with the last name Bernstein, turned out to be a stock photo model. I felt my chest begin to go cold. This was not a team. This was a facade. And then I remembered that very first folder that they sent me on the very first day. The starter pack with instructions. I opened it again. Before, I would skim through it, just move on to the tasks. But now I decided to read it carefully to the end. At the very end, on the last page, in small print, there was a note. Self-adaptation program. If you are reading this, you have completed the first cycle. Congratulations. Further participation is voluntary. The first cycle? Which cycle? My heart began to beat faster. I realized that no one was holding me back. No one was checking. I hold myself. This whole year I sat like a mouse in a wheel, chasing tasks that no one checked. I trained myself, I limited myself. This work was not real. It was an imitation of the structure. An experiment. Most likely, so.